The warehouse door gave way with a sound like breaking bones, rust flakes drifting to the concrete like autumn leaves from a dying tree. Chen pressed her shoulder harder against the warped metal until the gap widened enough for her and 7-year-old Danny to slip through into the darkness beyond. The October wind cut through her threadbare jacket, carrying the scent of harvest fields and the promise of an early winter that would kill them both if they didn't find shelter soon. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Mama, it smells funny in here, Danny whispered, his small hand finding hers in the blackness. His fingers were ice cold despite the wool mittens she'd knitted from yarn scrounged behind the church thrift store. The boy had been coughing for 3 days now, a wet sound that reminded Rebecca too much of her own father's final months. Rebecca clicked on the small flashlight she'd lifted from a gas station 3 towns back, its weak beam revealing the cavernous interior of what had once been Millbrook agricultural storage. Dust motes danced in the light like ghosts of better times, and the air hung heavy with the memory of grain and diesel fuel. Massive storage silos stretched toward a roof lost in shadow, their metal sides bearing the scars of rust and neglect. This place had once fed half the county. Now it fed only rats and the desperate. She'd driven past this warehouse countless times during the good years, back when she had a teaching job in Millbrook and Danny was just a baby sleeping in his car seat. The facility had been abandoned for nearly a decade, ever since the agricultural crisis drove most of the family farms into bankruptcy. Corporate agriculture had swallowed the smaller operations, leaving places like this to rot like bones picked clean by vultures. "Are we going to live here now?" Danny asked, his voice echoing off the concrete walls with the hollow sound of broken dreams. He'd stopped asking when they were going home 2 weeks ago, around the time they'd been evicted from the motel room that had served as their last address. "Just for tonight, baby," Rebecca lied, because the truth, that she had $17 in her pocket and no plan beyond surviving until morning, would break what remained of his innocence. The boy had already seen too much since Marcus walked out 6 months ago, taking their savings and leaving behind only mounting bills and a foreclosure notice that had started this nightmare. The warehouse stretched back further than her flashlight could penetrate, a maze of conveyor belts and sorting equipment that looked like the skeleton of some prehistoric beast. Rebecca led Danny deeper inside, searching for a corner that might block the wind, somewhere they could spread the sleeping bags she'd salvaged from their repossessed house. The concrete floor would be hard and cold, but it beat sleeping in the car again, especially with Danny's cough getting worse. "Look, Mama," Danny said, tugging on her jacket. "There's lights." Rebecca followed his pointing finger and saw what she'd missed in her desperate search for shelter. Deep in the back corner of the warehouse, a faint glow leaked from beneath what appeared to be an office door. Her blood ran cold. Someone else was here. Someone who might call the police, might report them for trespassing, might destroy the only refuge they'd found before the temperature dropped below freezing. "Stay close to me," she whispered, clicking off the flashlight and pulling Danny behind a massive grain separator. They crouched in the darkness, listening for voices or movement, but heard only the wind moaning through broken windows high above. The light remained steady, not flickering like a fire or flashlight, but consistent like electricity. Rebecca's mind raced through possibilities. Maybe the building wasn't as abandoned as it appeared. Maybe someone was living here already, another family like theirs, displaced and hiding. Or worse, maybe it was someone dangerous, someone who preyed on the desperate who sought shelter in forgotten places. Minutes passed in silence before Rebecca made her decision. They needed to know what they were dealing with, and they needed warmth more than they needed safety. She took Danny's hand and crept toward the light, her rubber-soled shoes silent on the concrete floor. The glow came from beneath a heavy metal door marked Site Supervisor. Rebecca pressed her ear against the cold steel but heard nothing. The door handle turned easily in her hand, and she pushed it open just enough to peer inside. The sight that greeted her defied explanation. The small office space had been converted into what looked like a primitive living quarters, with a cot, camping stove, and battery-powered lantern. But that wasn't what made her gasp. The walls were covered with maps, newspaper clippings, and photographs connected by red string like something from a detective movie. And spread across a makeshift desk were stacks of cash, more money than Rebecca had seen in her entire life. "Mama?" Danny whispered, sensing her shock. Rebecca pushed the door open wider, stepping into the office with her heart hammering against her ribs. The money wasn't just loose bills scattered around, it was organized in neat stacks, bound with rubber bands, filling several cardboard boxes. 20s, 50s, hundreds, all crisp and new-looking despite the warehouse's decay. But the money was only part of the mystery. The newspaper clippings on the walls told a story that made Rebecca's teaching degree in local history come flooding back. Headlines about the Millbrook Agricultural Cooperative's sudden closure. Articles about missing funds from the county's rural development program. Photos of local politicians and businessmen, some with their faces circled in red marker. "Someone was living here," Rebecca said softly, examining the cold camping stove and the dust-covered sleeping bag on the cot. "Not recently, though." Everything had the feeling of abandonment, as if whoever had been here had left in a hurry and never returned. Danny wandered to the far wall, where a large map of the county showed marked locations connected by the same red string as the newspaper clippings. "Mama, what do all these pictures mean?" Rebecca studied the wall more closely, her teacher's instincts kicking in despite their desperate circumstances. Someone had been investigating something, tracking connections between the failed agricultural cooperative, missing federal funds, and what appeared to be a network of local officials. The dates on the newspaper clippings spanned 3 years, ending abruptly 18 months ago. "I think someone was trying to solve a mystery," she told Danny, though the implications made her stomach clench with worry. If this money was connected to whatever investigation had been conducted here, taking it could make them criminals instead of just trespassers. But as she looked at her son's pale face and heard his harsh cough echo in the cold air, Rebecca's maternal instincts overruled her conscience. Danny needed medicine, warm clothes, and real food. They needed a place to live that wouldn't kill them before spring. Whatever moral complexity surrounded this money, her child's survival took precedence. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rebecca approached one of the cash boxes with trembling hands. The money felt real enough, crisp bills with the texture and weight of genuine currency. She counted one stack quickly, her eyes widening at the total. $5,000 in hundreds, and there were at least 20 similar stacks visible. More money than she'd made in a year of teaching before the school district's budget cuts eliminated her position. "Can we keep it, Mommy?" Danny asked, his 7-year-old logic seeing only the solution to their problems. The question hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Her son was asking if they could steal money, and her first instinct was to say yes. When had she become the kind of person who would consider theft? When hunger had become a constant companion? When she'd watched Danny grow thin despite her efforts to ensure he ate before she did? When she'd realized that being honest and hardworking and decent hadn't protected them from homelessness and desperation? She picked up one of the newspaper clippings, scanning the article about missing rural development funds that were supposed to help struggling farm families keep their land. The irony wasn't lost on her, money meant to help people like them had disappeared, and now she was standing in a room full of cash wondering if taking it made her a criminal or just another victim fighting for survival. "I don't know, baby," she said honestly. "This money doesn't belong to us." "But nobody's here," Danny pointed out with child logic. "And we need it more than whoever left it." Rebecca's flashlight beam caught something else, a manila folder labeled insurance tucked beneath one of the cash boxes. Inside were documents that made her blood run cold. Life insurance policies, death certificates, and what appeared to be a detailed plan for disappearing from Millbrook County. The most recent document was a handwritten note dated 18 months ago. "They're getting too close. Time to go. If anyone finds this, remember that Morrison knew everything." The name Morrison triggered a memory from Rebecca's teaching days. Harold Morrison had been the county agricultural commissioner, a man who'd championed small farmers and fought against corporate takeovers. He'd died in a car accident 2 years ago, around the time the agricultural cooperative had started experiencing financial problems. Rebecca sank into the office chair, overwhelmed by the implications of what they'd stumbled into. This wasn't just money, it was evidence of something much larger, something that had forced someone into hiding and possibly gotten Harold Morrison killed. Taking this cash wouldn't just be theft, it could make them targets of whoever had driven its previous guardian away. But Danny's cough chose that moment to worsen, doubling him over with harsh spasms that sounded like his lungs were tearing apart. Rebecca knelt beside him, rubbing his back as he struggled to breathe, and felt the walls of her moral universe shift. Whatever dangerous game this money was connected to, her son was dying by degrees in the cold, and she had the means to save him literally within reach. "We're going to take some of it," she decided, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. "Just enough to get you to a doctor and find us a warm place to stay while we figure out what to do next." Danny nodded, too exhausted from coughing to argue, and Rebecca began stuffing bills into her backpack with hands that shook from fear rather than cold. She took 3 stacks, $15,000 that represented more money than she'd ever possessed but still left the vast majority untouched. Enough to help them survive without being so much that someone would immediately notice its absence. As she zipped the backpack closed, Rebecca caught sight of herself in a cracked mirror propped against the wall. The woman looking back at her was a stranger, hollow-cheeked, desperate-eyed, with the haunted expression of someone who'd crossed a line she could never uncross. 6 months ago, she'd been a respected teacher with a mortgage and retirement savings. Now she was a thief hiding in an abandoned warehouse with stolen money and a sick child. The transformation felt complete when Danny tugged on her sleeve and whispered, "Mama, I think someone's coming." Through the office windows, Rebecca saw headlights cutting through the darkness, moving slowly along the access road that led to the warehouse. Her blood turned to ice water as she realized their footprints in the dust would be clearly visible to anyone with a flashlight, and the forced door would announce their presence to whoever was approaching. "Quick, baby, we need to hide," she whispered, grabbing Danny's hand and clicking off their flashlight. But as they stumbled toward the door, Rebecca realized they had nowhere to run. The warehouse had only one exit, and the approaching vehicle was positioned to block any escape. They were trapped with $15,000 in stolen cash, a room full of evidence pointing to massive corruption, and the growing certainty that whoever was coming had been watching this place, waiting for someone exactly like them to arrive. The headlights grew brighter, and Rebecca pulled Danny deeper into the shadows, knowing that in the next few minutes, they would learn whether she'd just saved her son's life or signed their death warrant by walking into a mystery that had already claimed at least one life and driven its last guardian into exile. The engine outside cut off, leaving only the sound of Danny's labored breathing and the distant slam of a car door. The footsteps outside moved with the measured cadence of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Rebecca pressed Danny against her chest behind the desk, feeling his small body trembling from cold and fever, his breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps that seemed impossibly loud in the suffocating silence. Through the grimy office windows, she could see a figure moving methodically around the warehouse perimeter, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness like a blade. The beam paused at the forced entry door, lingering on the bent metal and scattered rust flakes that marked their passage. Rebecca's heart hammered so hard she was certain it would give them away. The $15,000 in her backpack felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, each bill screaming their guilt into the night air. "Whoever you are," a voice called out, echoing through the cavernous space, "I know you're in here. I saw the car parked down the road." The voice belonged to a woman, older, with the weathered authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Rebecca risked a glance through the window and saw a figure in a sheriff's department jacket, but something about her movements suggested this wasn't an official visit. She moved too carefully, too quietly, like someone who didn't want to be heard by anyone else who might be listening. Danny's cough erupted without warning, a harsh sound that might as well have been a gunshot in the stillness. The flashlight beam immediately swung toward their hiding place, and Rebecca knew their concealment was over. She stood slowly, pulling Danny up with her, and stepped into the doorway of the office with her hands partially raised. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My son is sick. We just needed somewhere warm." The woman approaching them was in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back severely and eyes that held the particular weariness of someone who'd seen too much human suffering. Her sheriff's jacket was worn and unofficial looking, and Rebecca noticed she wore no badge or radio. This wasn't Deputy Sarah Wells making her evening rounds. This was someone operating outside the law, just as they were. Sarah Kowalski, the woman said, lowering her flashlight so it wouldn't blind them. I used to work dispatch for the county. Been keeping an eye on this place since. She trailed off, her gaze taking in the office behind Rebecca with its wall of investigation materials and stacks of cash. Since what? Rebecca asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. Since Harold Morrison died and Tommy Brennan disappeared, Sarah said simply. Tommy was the one living here, trying to piece together what really happened to the agricultural cooperative money. $43 million in federal grants that were supposed to save family farms, all vanished into shell companies and fake contracts. Rebecca felt Danny lean heavily against her leg, his small body radiating heat from fever. The weight of the stolen money in her backpack seemed to double. We didn't know, she said. We were just looking for shelter. Sarah's expression softened as she took in Danny's condition, the way he clung to his mother's worn jacket, the hollow look of prolonged hunger in both their faces. You're the teacher, she said with sudden recognition. Rebecca Chen. You taught my grandson before the school district cut your position. The unexpected connection hit Rebecca like a physical blow. In her desperation, she'd forgotten how small rural communities really were, how everyone's story intersected with everyone else's. Sarah Kowalski's grandson was Billy, a sweet third grader who'd struggled with reading until Rebecca spent extra hours helping him after school. Now that same teacher was standing in an abandoned warehouse with stolen money, facing the boy's grandmother across a chasm of broken trust. Billy's doing well in 4th grade, Sarah continued, her voice gentle despite the circumstances. Still talks about how you helped him with his reading. Says you made him feel smart for the first time. The words were meant as kindness, but they cut deeper than any accusation could have. Rebecca had prided herself on being the kind of teacher who saw potential in every child, who fought for students others gave up on. Now she was modeling theft and desperation for her own son, teaching him that survival sometimes meant abandoning everything she'd claimed to believe about right and wrong. Mrs. Kowalski, Rebecca said, using the formal address from her teaching days because it felt like armor against the shame. We won't take anything more. We'll leave right now if you want. With what? Sarah asked, nodding toward the backpack. How much did you take? The direct question hung in the air between them. Rebecca could lie, could claim they'd taken nothing, but the weight of the money was obvious and Sarah's eyes missed nothing. 15,000, she admitted. My son needs medicine, and I didn't know what else to do. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her flashlight beam playing across the evidence wall where Tommy Brennan had mapped the connections between missing funds, mysterious deaths, and local officials who'd grown rich while family farms died. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weariness that seemed to come from her bones. Tommy Brennan was my nephew, she said. My sister's boy. He came back from the army with a head for numbers and a conscience too big for this county. When he started asking questions about where the agricultural money really went, I told him to be careful. Should have told him to run. The revelation reframed everything. Sarah wasn't here by accident or as part of some official investigation. She was family, looking for answers about what had happened to someone she loved. Rebecca felt the moral ground shift beneath her feet again, understanding that she'd stumbled into a story much larger and more dangerous than simple abandoned money. What happened to him? Rebecca asked. Same thing that happened to Harold Morrison, probably, Sarah said with bitter certainty. Harold was getting close to proving that County Commissioner Walsh and his friends had stolen every penny of federal money meant for struggling farmers. Then his car went off Millbrook Bridge on a clear night with good roads. Tommy picked up where Harold left off, and one morning his apartment was cleaned out like he'd never existed. Danny's cough worsened, doubling him over with spasms that left him gasping. Rebecca knelt beside him, rubbing his back while her mind raced through the implications of what Sarah was telling her. The money in her backpack wasn't just stolen funds, it was evidence in multiple murders, the kind of evidence that had already gotten at least 2 men killed. The money, Rebecca said, looking up at Sarah. Is it part of the missing federal funds? Some of it, Sarah confirmed. Tommy was smart enough to track down 3 different accounts where Walsh and his people were hiding money. He managed to withdraw what he could before they caught on, planning to use it as proof of what they'd done. But they moved faster than he expected. Sarah moved into the office, her flashlight illuminating Tommy's investigation wall in detail. Photos of Walsh and other county officials at expensive restaurants and political fundraisers. Bank records showing impossible coincidences between federal fund disbursements and personal account deposits. A timeline that connected the agricultural cooperative's collapse to a series of convenient deaths and disappearances. $43 million, Sarah said, running her finger along one of the red strings connecting newspaper clippings. Money that was supposed to help families like the Hendersons keep their dairy farm, or let old Pete Kowalski, no relation, different family, modernize his grain operation instead of selling to corporate buyers. Instead, it bought vacation homes in Florida and new trucks for people who already had everything. Rebecca studied the wall with her teacher's eye for research and documentation. Tommy Brennan had built an airtight case against Walsh and his network, complete with paper trails, witness testimony, and financial records. But he'd also signed his own death warrant in the process. Why didn't he take this to the state police? Rebecca asked. Or the FBI? Sarah's laugh held no humor. Walsh has connections all the way to the state capitol. Half the judges in 3 counties owe their elections to his political machine. Tommy tried going through official channels first, got stonewalled, and then people started dying. By the time he realized how deep it went, he was already marked. Danny slumped against Rebecca's leg, his fever making him listless and barely responsive. His breathing had become labored, each inhalation a struggle that tore at her heart. Whatever moral complexity surrounded this money, her son needed medical attention immediately. Mrs. Kowalski, Rebecca said, desperation bleeding into her voice. Danny's really sick. I know what this looks like, but I swear I'll pay back every penny if you just let me get him to a doctor first. Sarah studied the boy with grandmother's eyes, noting the flush of fever and the way he struggled for each breath. Her expression shifted from weariness to compassion, the human connection overriding law enforcement training. Keep the money, she said finally. But not for the reasons you think. Rebecca blinked in confusion. I don't understand. Tommy left instructions, Sarah explained, moving to a filing cabinet Rebecca hadn't noticed. From the bottom drawer, she withdrew a sealed envelope with Rebecca's name written on it in careful handwriting. He said if anything happened to him, and if someone with a child ever found this place, I should give them this letter and let them take what they needed. Rebecca stared at the envelope, her hands shaking as she took it. He knew my name? But how could he? Tommy was Harold Morrison's research assistant before he enlisted, Sarah said. He knew every family in the county who'd been hurt by the agricultural collapse. Your husband's gambling debts, the foreclosure on your house, your son's medical bills from his breathing problems. Tommy kept track of all the real victims while Walsh and his friends got rich. The letter felt heavier than the money in Rebecca's backpack. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in Tommy's precise handwriting, dated just days before his disappearance. If you're reading this, it means they got to me before I could finish what Harold started. The money in this room represents the tip of an iceberg that goes all the way to Washington. Commissioner Walsh and his network stole $43 million meant to save family farms, and they've killed to keep it secret. But they made one mistake, they kept electronic records of everything, thinking they were too powerful to ever face justice. The evidence you need is hidden where they'll never think to look. Go to Morrison's old farm, the one that's been empty since his death. In the barn, third stall from the left, there's a loose floorboard. Underneath you'll find everything, bank records, recorded conversations, video evidence of money changing hands. Enough to bring them all down. Use the money to take care of your family first. Then, when you're ready, finish what we started. The families who lost their farms deserve justice, and the only way they'll get it is if someone with nothing left to lose fights for them. Trust Sarah Kowalski. She's the only one in law enforcement who can't be bought. Rebecca read the letter twice, her hands trembling with more than just cold. Tommy Brennan had anticipated this moment, had planned for someone exactly like her to stumble into his investigation. A desperate parent with a sick child and nothing left to lose, someone who might have both the motivation and the moral flexibility to finish what he'd started. He knew, she whispered. He knew someone like me would end up here. Tommy understood that real change doesn't come from people who play by the rules, Sarah said. It comes from parents who'll do anything to protect their children, from people who've lost everything and have nothing left to fear. Danny's cough erupted again, weaker this time, and Rebecca felt panic rise in her throat. Her son was getting worse, and standing in this warehouse debating justice and corruption wouldn't save him. She needed to get him medical attention immediately. The money, she said, shouldering her backpack. You're really going to let me take it? It belongs to the people of this county anyway, Sarah replied. Walsh stole it from federal programs meant to help families like yours. Taking it back isn't theft, it's recovery. Rebecca felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders like winter snow. She could take the money and run, use it to get Danny the medical care he needed and disappear to someplace where Walsh's influence couldn't reach them. Or she could stay and fight, using Tommy's evidence to expose a corruption network that had destroyed countless families while enriching the powerful. The choice felt impossible until she looked at Danny's pale face and remembered all the other children in her former classroom whose parents had lost farms, jobs, and hope to the same system that had driven her to this desperate moment. How many other families were out there right now, choosing between medicine and food, between heat and rent, while Walsh and his friends counted money that should have saved them? Morrison's farm, she said, meeting Sarah's eyes. You'll help me get the evidence? Already been there, Sarah admitted. Took photos of everything Tommy hid, made copies, stored them in safe deposit boxes in 3 different counties. Been waiting for the right moment and the right person to make it all public. Rebecca understood then that this had always been a trap, not for her, but for Walsh and his network. Tommy Brennan had set up a dead man's switch, knowing that sooner or later someone would find his investigation and someone else would choose to act on it. Sarah had been the guardian of that switch, waiting for a person desperate enough and moral enough to pull it. After I get Danny to a doctor, Rebecca said, the decision crystallizing in her mind like frost on morning grass. After I know he's safe and taken care of. Then we finish what they started. Sarah nodded, understanding passing between them like a current. 2 women who'd lost too much to the same corrupt system, connected now by circumstance and a dead man's plan for justice. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the warehouse walls and carrying the scent of rain. Storm weather was coming, the kind that would wash the county clean or drown it, depending on how deep the water rose and how well the foundations held. Rebecca picked up Danny, feeling him settle against her shoulder with the trust only children possessed, and followed Sarah toward the exit. Behind them, the evidence wall stood in the darkness like a monument to the dead, waiting for justice or burial, whichever came first. The land kept its secrets well, but it also remembered everything. And sometimes, when the conditions were right, it offered up the truth to those brave enough to dig for it. 3 weeks later, Rebecca stood in the county courthouse holding Danny's hand while he clutched a new inhaler in his free fist, his breathing finally clear for the first time in months. The emergency room visit had revealed pneumonia that would have killed him within days, but antibiotics and proper treatment had brought him back from the edge. The stolen money had bought more than medicine, it had bought time, hope, and the clarity that comes when a parent no longer has to choose between their child's life and their conscience. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, farmers and their families filling every seat and lining the walls like witnesses to a reckoning 3 years in the making. Rebecca recognized many faces from her teaching days, parents who'd pulled their children from school when they lost the family farm, neighbors who'd aged a decade in the months since the agricultural collapse. They sat with the quiet dignity of people who'd been beaten down but not broken, their weathered hands folded in their laps as they waited for justice they'd stopped believing would ever come. At the defendant's table, County Commissioner Walsh sat in his expensive suit, his face bearing the particular pallor of a man watching his carefully constructed world crumble in real time. Beside him sat 3 other officials, their names familiar from Tommy Brennan's investigation wall, the county treasurer who'd approved phantom contracts, the agricultural extension director who'd certified non-existent farms, and the bank president who'd laundered federal funds through shell companies registered to dead people. District Attorney Patricia Morgan stood to address the packed courtroom, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd built her career on cases exactly like this one. She was an outsider, brought in from the state capitol when it became clear that local prosecutors had been compromised by Walsh's political machine. Her presence alone signaled how far the scandal had reached beyond Millbrook County. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morgan began, "what we're witnessing today is the culmination of the largest agricultural fraud case in our state's history. $43 million in federal funds meant to save family farms was systematically stolen over a period of 5 years through a network of corruption that reaches from this courthouse to Washington, D.C. Rebecca felt Danny squeeze her hand as Morgan outlined the charges: fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, and racketeering. Each count represented families like theirs, farmers who'd trusted their government to help them survive impossible circumstances only to discover that help had been stolen by the very people elected to protect them. The evidence that convicted them had come from Tommy Brennan's hidden cash, just as his letter had promised. Rebecca and Sarah had retrieved it together on a rain-soaked morning 2 weeks after that first night in the warehouse, driving to Harold Morrison's abandoned farm as storm clouds gathered overhead. The barn had stood empty for 2 years, its stalls filled only with memories and the mice that nested in forgotten hay. Finding the loose floorboard in the third stall had felt like archaeology, digging up secrets the earth had swallowed and preserved. Underneath lay waterproof containers holding flash drives, recorded phone conversations, bank statements, and photographs that documented every step of the theft. Tommy had been methodical in his investigation, patient in his evidence gathering, and prescient in his preparation for betrayal. But the most damning evidence hadn't come from Tommy's investigation at all. It had come from Walsh himself, in the form of a cell phone recording Rebecca had made 3 days after leaving the warehouse. The plan had been Sarah's idea, born from decades of watching powerful men underestimate desperate women. Rebecca would approach Walsh directly, claiming to have found money in the abandoned warehouse and offering to sell him information about Tommy Brennan's investigation. The wire Sarah had provided was barely larger than a button, hidden beneath Rebecca's collar as she walked into Walsh's office with her heart hammering against her ribs. Walsh had been exactly what she'd expected: arrogant, dismissive, certain of his own invincibility. He'd offered her $1,000 to forget what she'd seen, then increased it to $5,000 when she hesitated, and finally to $10,000 when she mentioned Tommy's name. But what sealed his fate was his casual admission that Tommy Brennan had been getting too close to the truth and had needed to be dealt with permanently. "These people come around asking questions," Walsh had said, leaning back in his leather chair with the confidence of someone who'd never faced consequences. "Sometimes they have accidents. Sometimes they just disappear. Depends on how much trouble they want to cause." The recording had played in open court just that morning, Walsh's voice filling the courthouse with his own words of guilt. Rebecca had watched the color drain from his face as he heard himself describing Tommy's murder with the casual indifference of someone discussing livestock prices. Now, as the judge prepared to read the verdict, Rebecca found herself thinking not about justice or revenge, but about the land itself. The farms that had been lost would mostly stay lost, sold to corporate agriculture companies that could afford to wait years for profits. The families scattered by economic disaster wouldn't magically reassemble. The children who'd grown up watching their parents lose everything wouldn't forget that betrayal just because the betrayers finally faced consequences. But something had changed in the county since the arrests began. Rebecca had seen it in the way people looked at each other now, in the conversations that happened at the grocery store and the grain elevator. The knowledge that their suffering hadn't been inevitable, that it had been engineered by people they'd trusted, had transformed grief into anger and anger into determination. The judge's voice cut through her reverie. "On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, we find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause, but Rebecca felt only exhaustion. Danny looked up at her with eyes that seemed older than his 7 years, watching the adults around them celebrate with the intensity of people who'd waited too long for vindication. "Are the bad men going to jail now, Mama?" he asked in a whisper that somehow carried above the courtroom noise. "Yes, baby," she replied, though she knew jail time wouldn't restore the $43 million or bring back the families who'd been destroyed in the meantime. Justice and healing weren't the same thing, and the latter would take much longer than the former. As they filed out of the courthouse with the crowd, Sarah Kowalski appeared at Rebecca's elbow, her expression reflecting the same mixture of satisfaction and sorrow that Rebecca felt. The older woman had testified earlier that week, her law enforcement credentials lending weight to the evidence she'd helped preserve. But Rebecca could see in her eyes the cost of watching her nephew's investigation vindicated only after his death. "Tommy would be proud," Sarah said quietly, watching the celebrating crowd spill onto the courthouse steps. "He always said the truth had a way of surfacing eventually, like spring water finding its way through rock." Rebecca nodded, thinking about the teacher she'd been before desperation had forced her to steal money from dead men and wear wires to trap murderers. That woman felt like someone she'd known long ago, before life had taught her that survival sometimes required moral compromises that couldn't be undone or fully justified. But perhaps that was the real lesson hidden in the soil of Millbrook County, that good people could be forced to do questionable things, and that the measure of their character lay not in avoiding difficult choices but in what they did after making them. Rebecca had taken the money to save her son, but she'd also used it to seek justice for others. She'd entered a warehouse as a thief and emerged as something harder to define but more necessary. The Federal Restitution Fund would provide some compensation to affected families, though nothing could fully restore what they'd lost. Rebecca and Danny were entitled to a substantial settlement, enough to buy a small house and start over somewhere new. But as they walked through downtown Millbrook, past the empty storefronts and for sale signs that marked the agricultural collapse's aftermath, Rebecca found herself reconsidering their options. "Mrs. Chen," a familiar voice called from across the street. Rebecca turned to see Billy Kowalski, Sarah's grandson, running toward them with a gap-toothed grin. He'd grown several inches since she'd last seen him, but his enthusiasm was unchanged. Behind him walked his mother, Janet, whose farm had been one of those saved by the early exposure of Walsh's crimes. "Billy," Rebecca said, accepting his enthusiastic hug. "How's fourth grade treating you?" "Good," he said, then lowered his voice conspiratorially. "Grandma says you helped catch the bad guys who stole money from farmers. Is that true?" Rebecca glanced at Janet, who nodded with gratitude and understanding. The story of Rebecca's role in exposing the corruption had spread through the community, though the details remained necessarily vague. She'd become something of a folk hero, the desperate mother who'd stumbled into justice and chosen to pursue it despite the personal cost. "I had some help from your grandmother," Rebecca replied diplomatically. "And from some friends who cared about doing the right thing." Janet stepped forward, her expression serious. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "Not just for exposing what they did, but for showing our kids that fighting back is possible. Billy talks about you all the time, says when he grows up, he wants to help people like you do." The words hit Rebecca unexpectedly hard. In her desperation to save Danny, she'd never considered what example she might be setting for other children. But perhaps that was the most important legacy of all, showing the next generation that ordinary people could stand up to powerful corruption, that teachers and mothers and grandmothers could be heroes when circumstances demanded it. Over the following weeks, as the initial euphoria of the convictions settled into the harder work of rebuilding, Rebecca found herself drawn deeper into the community she'd once planned to leave behind. The elementary school had offered her a position teaching a combined class of children whose families had been affected by the agricultural crisis, kids who'd experienced instability and loss but who needed to believe in the possibility of renewal. The classroom she was given occupied the same wing where she'd taught before the budget cuts, but everything about her approach had changed. These children had seen their parents lose farms and homes and hope, had watched adults they trusted betray that trust, had learned too early that the world wasn't fair and that fairness had to be fought for rather than assumed. Her first lesson had nothing to do with mathematics or reading. Instead, she'd told them about Tommy Brennan and Harold Morrison, about people who'd dedicated their lives to protecting others and about how their work had continued even after their deaths. She'd explained that heroes weren't always people in uniforms or positions of power, sometimes they were farmers who asked difficult questions, dispatchers who preserved evidence, and teachers who chose to fight rather than flee. The land remembers everything, she'd told her students, echoing something Sarah had said during one of their late-night conversations. It remembers the crops that grew here and the families who tended them. It remembers the promises that were made and the ones that were broken. And it remembers the people who fought to make things right. Danny had enrolled in her class, not because he needed special attention but because Rebecca wanted him to understand the full story of their transformation. He'd grown stronger through the autumn, his breathing improving in the clean country air, his confidence returning as he made friends with children who understood what it meant to lose everything and fight to get some of it back. On the last day of November, as the first snow began to fall across the county, Rebecca stood in her classroom after dismissal, watching through frost-touched windows as her students waited for buses that would take them home to farms both failed and surviving. The federal restitution funds had helped some families hold on to their land, while others had chosen to take their settlements and start over elsewhere. Both choices required courage, she'd learned. Staying and rebuilding was heroic, but so was knowing when to seek new ground. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Morrison Farm is going up for auction next week. Bank wants to clear the title. Thought you should know. Rebecca stared at the message, remembering the empty barn where they'd retrieved Tommy's evidence, the farmhouse where Harold Morrison had lived and died fighting for his neighbors. The property had been in legal limbo since his death, tied up in the criminal proceedings, but now the courts were ready to settle his estate. That evening, as she and Danny worked on his homework at their kitchen table in the small rental house they'd moved to after leaving the motel, Rebecca found herself thinking about roots and permanence, about the difference between running from trouble and growing through it. The settlement money was sitting in a savings account, earning modest interest while she decided what to do with their newfound stability. "Mama," Danny said, looking up from his math worksheet, "Mrs. Henderson asked me today if we're going to stay in Millbrook." Mrs. Henderson was the school secretary, whose family dairy farm had been saved when the corruption was exposed early enough to stop their foreclosure. Her question reflected the uncertainty that hung over many families, those who'd been hurt by Walsh's crimes but weren't sure whether the community could ever fully heal from the damage. "What did you tell her?" Rebecca asked. "I said I didn't know," Danny replied honestly. "Are we?" Rebecca studied her son's face, noting the way his color had improved since getting proper medical care, the confidence that had returned to his voice now that he wasn't constantly struggling to breathe. He'd made friends here, had found his place in a community that understood what he'd been through because they'd been through it too. "Would you want to?" she asked. "Stay, I mean?" Danny considered this with the seriousness of someone who'd learned not to take stability for granted. "I like my school," he said finally. "And I like that everyone knows we helped catch the bad guys. It makes me feel proud." Pride. Rebecca turned the word over in her mind, remembering how foreign that emotion had felt during the months of desperation and homelessness. She'd been so focused on shame, shame at their circumstances, shame at Marcus's abandonment, shame at her inability to provide for Danny despite her education and good intentions. But their experiences in the warehouse and courtroom had transformed that shame into something harder and more valuable. The next morning, she called the bank handling the Morrison estate auction. The farm was small by modern agricultural standards, 40 acres of furrow ground with a modest farmhouse and the barn where they'd found Tommy's evidence. The asking price was reasonable, well within what her settlement money could cover, but that wasn't what made her heart race as she spoke with the bank officer. It was the realization that she could own the place where the truth had been preserved, could turn it into something that honored both Harold Morrison's sacrifice and Tommy Brennan's determination. Not a shrine to the dead, but a working farm where children could learn about growing things from soil that had been watered with both tears and justice. The auction was scheduled for the following Friday, but by Wednesday morning Rebecca had submitted a sealed bid that exceeded the asking price by $20,000. She didn't want to risk losing the property to speculation or corporate buyers who would see only development potential where she saw the possibility of renewal. When the bank called Thursday evening to inform her that her bid had been accepted, Rebecca felt a settling sensation in her chest that she recognized as belonging. Not the desperate belonging of someone with no other options, but the chosen belonging of someone who'd found their place through struggle and intended to defend it. That night, as snow continued to fall across Millbrook County, covering the stubbled fields and empty silos with clean white promise, Rebecca sat with Danny on their couch reading him a story about farmers and seasons, about seeds that waited through winter darkness for spring's return. Outside their window, the land lay quiet under its blanket of snow, holding its secrets and memories, waiting for someone with strong hands and a patient heart to wake it from its rest. The warehouse where their journey had begun stood empty again, its broken door sealed now with official notices. But the story it had started continued in courtrooms and classrooms, in saved farms and second chances, in the way a community learned to trust again by watching ordinary people choose courage over comfort. Rebecca had come to Millbrook County as a refugee from her own life, carrying nothing but desperation and love for her child. She would stay as its newest farmer, carrying the knowledge that sometimes the best crop you can grow is hope, and that the richest soil is often found in the places where the hardest battles have been fought and won. The land remembered everything, and now it would remember this too, the winter when justice finally came home to roost, and a teacher became a farmer by planting truth in ground that had been waiting 3 years for someone brave enough to tend it properly. 5 years had passed since Rebecca first broke into the abandoned warehouse, and the Morrison farm had awakened from its long sleep like a field coming back to life after drought. The farmhouse now wore fresh white paint that caught the morning light, its wraparound porch restored to the dignity it had possessed when Harold Morrison first walked its boards as a young man. The barn stood solid and true, its red siding gleaming against the backdrop of rolling fields where corn grew tall and straight, each stalk a testament to soil that had been enriched by struggle and watered with truth. Rebecca stood at her kitchen window, watching Danny help Sarah Kowalski collect eggs from the chicken coop they'd built behind the barn. At 12 years old, he moved with the easy confidence of a boy who'd never doubted where he belonged, his laughter carrying across the yard as Sarah's old rooster chased him in mock aggression. His asthma was nothing but a memory now, his lungs cleared by clean country air and the peace that comes from knowing your ground is solid beneath your feet. The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy. Those first years on the Morrison farm had tested Rebecca's resolve in ways she couldn't have imagined when she'd signed the deed with trembling hands. The house had needed more repair than anyone suspected, the plumbing ancient and the electrical system a maze of patches and shortcuts that had taken a full summer to rewire. The fields had been fallow so long that bringing them back to productivity required patience and faith in roughly equal measure. But the land had remembered how to grow things. By their second spring, Rebecca had planted her first serious crop, heirloom corn varieties that Harold Morrison had cultivated for decades before his death. The seeds had come from Tommy Brennan's personal collection, preserved in Sarah's freezer through all the years of legal battles and criminal trials. When the green shoots pushed through the black soil that June morning, Rebecca had felt something settle in her chest that she recognized as home. The education center had been Danny's idea, born from his 12-year-old's logic that if the farm was a place where important things had happened, then other kids should get to learn about them too. The converted barn now hosted school groups twice a month, children from across 3 counties coming to learn about agriculture, environmental science, and what Rebecca carefully termed civic responsibility. She never mentioned corruption directly, but she taught them about asking questions, about standing up for what was right even when it was difficult, about the way communities could heal themselves if enough people chose courage over comfort. The memorial garden bloomed behind the farmhouse, where Rebecca had planted native wildflowers and heritage vegetables in patterns that honored both Harold Morrison and Tommy Brennan. Their names were carved into a simple stone bench where visitors could sit and contemplate the view across fields that stretched to the horizon. Sarah visited every Sunday after church, sometimes bringing flowers, more often just sitting in companionable silence with the dead. The county had changed too, in ways both subtle and profound. The federal oversight that followed the corruption trials had brought new programs, new money, and most importantly, new accountability to every agricultural initiative. 3 family farms had been saved from foreclosure, their operations stabilized by grants administered through a system designed to prevent the kind of theft that had destroyed so many others. It wasn't enough to restore everything that had been lost, but it was enough to prove that recovery was possible. Rebecca had testified before the state legislature twice, her quiet authority compelling lawmakers who rarely listened to voices from places like Millbrook County. She spoke about the ripple effects of corruption, about children who'd watched their parents lose everything to systems designed to protect them, about the patience required to rebuild trust once it had been shattered. The Agricultural Transparency Act that passed the following year bore her influence, though her name appeared nowhere in its language. The warehouse where their story had begun had been converted into a food distribution center, its vast spaces now filled with donated produce and dry goods for families still struggling in the aftermath of economic collapse. Rebecca served on its board of directors, her experience with hunger and desperation lending authenticity to policy discussions about nutrition and access. Danny volunteered there on weekends, helping sort donations with the matter-of-fact compassion of someone who remembered being on the receiving end of charity. The money had never felt entirely clean, despite its righteous purpose. $43 million had been recovered and distributed to affected families, but the $15,000 Rebecca had taken that desperate night remained in a separate account, growing slowly with modest interest. She'd tried to return it twice, but federal prosecutors insisted it was properly classified as whistleblower compensation for her role in exposing the conspiracy. The money sat untouched, a reminder of the moment when her life had pivoted from desperation toward purpose. This morning was different, though Rebecca couldn't have said why until she saw the car turning into their driveway. A modest sedan with government plates, moving slowly as if its passenger was reluctant to arrive at this particular destination. Rebecca recognized the driver immediately, Janet Morrison, Harold's daughter, whom she'd met only once before, at the criminal sentencing 5 years earlier. Janet had inherited her father's intensity, the same careful eyes that missed nothing and stored everything for future reference. She'd become a federal prosecutor after her father's death, dedicating her career to cases involving agricultural fraud and corruption. Her presence at the Morrison farm was unprecedented. She'd maintained polite distance from the property and its new occupants, perhaps finding Rebecca's presence there too painful a reminder of what had been lost. Mrs. Chen, Janet said as she stepped from her car, her formal address carrying the weight of unspoken complexity. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced." Rebecca met her at the edge of the driveway, wiping dirt from her hands with the dish towel she'd been carrying. She'd been planning the winter garden, marking locations for cold weather vegetables that would carry them through until spring planting. The irony wasn't lost on her, standing on Harold Morrison's land, discussing its future with his daughter. "Of course not," Rebecca replied. "Would you like to see what we've done with the place?" Janet nodded, her professional composure cracking slightly as she took in the restored farmhouse, the productive fields, the obvious signs of a property loved and tended with care. Rebecca led her through the barn where Tommy's investigation had been preserved, now converted to its new educational purpose. The walls displayed historical photographs of family farms throughout the county's history, including several of Harold Morrison working these same fields in the years before his death. "He would have loved this," Janet said quietly, studying a photo of her father operating his 1970s-era tractor. "The education center, the memorial garden. He always said the land's real purpose was teaching people how to take care of each other." They walked through the fields where corn stubble caught the afternoon light, past the restored chicken coop where Sarah and Danny were still engaged in mock combat with the territorial rooster. Janet moved with the familiarity of someone who'd run these paths as a child, her feet finding the least muddy routes automatically despite years of absence. "I owe you an apology," Janet said as they reached the memorial garden. "When you bought this place, I was angry. It felt like strangers profiting from my father's death. I didn't understand that you weren't strangers at all, you were exactly who he would have wanted here." Rebecca sat on the memorial bench, gesturing for Janet to join her. The stone was warm from autumn sunshine, comfortable despite the cooling air that promised frost before morning. From here, they could see the entire farm spread before them, the house where Harold had lived and died, the barn where Tommy had hidden evidence, the fields that had been fallow during the worst years but now produced food for families throughout the region. "He chose this land carefully," Janet continued. "Not just for farming, but for what it represented. Independence, sustainability, the idea that ordinary people could take care of themselves if they were just given a fair chance. When the corruption started, when he realized how the system was being manipulated, it broke something in him that never healed. Rebecca understood. She'd felt that same breaking in her own spirit during the months of desperation that preceded their arrival here. The difference was that Harold Morrison had fought the corruption from within the system, using his official position as agricultural commissioner to challenge policies he knew were destroying family farms. Rebecca had entered the battle as an outsider, with nothing left to lose and therefore everything to gain from taking risks others couldn't afford. "Tommy told me before he disappeared," Janet said, "that someone would come eventually. Someone with the motivation and the moral flexibility to finish what my father started. He said it would probably be a parent, someone desperate enough to take chances but principled enough to choose justice over pure survival." The words hung in the air between them, acknowledging the strange alchemy that had brought Rebecca to this place and this purpose. She'd stolen money to save her son, but she'd also chosen to fight for justice when escape would have been easier. The contradiction didn't resolve cleanly, but perhaps that was the point. Real heroism rarely emerged from simple moral choices. "I have something that belongs to you," Janet said, reaching into her briefcase. She withdrew a manila envelope, its edges worn from handling. "My father's personal journals from the years before his death. The prosecutors returned them after the trials ended, but they belong here now, with the land." Rebecca accepted the envelope with careful hands, understanding the weight of what she was being given. These were Harold Morrison's private thoughts during the darkest period of his life, his attempts to make sense of a corruption so comprehensive it had challenged his faith in the systems he'd devoted his career to serving. "There's something else," Janet said. "The federal government wants to establish a permanent monitoring program for agricultural fraud, based on what happened here. They've offered me the position of director, but I've recommended you instead." The suggestion took Rebecca by surprise. She'd found her rhythm on the Morrison farm, had built a life that balanced teaching and farming in ways that felt sustainable and meaningful. The idea of returning to anything resembling her old professional world seemed foreign, though she recognized the honor in Janet's recommendation. "I'm not a prosecutor," Rebecca said. "I'm not even sure I'm qualified for whatever they have in mind." "You're the woman who exposed the largest agricultural fraud in state history," Janet replied. "You understand both the systems being manipulated and the families being hurt by that manipulation. You've built bridges between law enforcement and rural communities that didn't exist before. Most importantly, you've proven that integrity doesn't require perfection, that someone can make difficult choices and still choose justice in the end." As they sat in the memorial garden while shadows lengthened across the fields, Rebecca found herself thinking about legacy and inheritance, about the ways that purpose passed from one generation to the next like seeds carried by wind. Harold Morrison had planted the questions that Tommy Brennan had cultivated into evidence. Tommy's sacrifice had created the opportunity that Rebecca had chosen to embrace. Now she was being asked to plant seeds that might grow into protections for families she would never meet, in places she might never see. The federal position would mean leaving the Morrison farm, though not necessarily forever. The education center could continue under Sarah's direction, and the land itself would remain productive regardless of who happened to hold its deed. But something about the farm had gotten into Rebecca's blood during their 5 years here, had taught her that some kinds of wealth couldn't be measured in dollars or career advancement. "Let me think about it," she said finally. "This place has been good to us. It feels like leaving before the work is finished." Janet smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Rebecca had seen from her. "My father used to say that farming was about faith, planting seeds in spring without knowing what autumn would bring. Maybe that's true for justice too. You plant the questions and the consequences, then trust that someone else will tend them properly when the time comes." They walked back to the house as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that made the ordinary landscape look timeless and sacred. Danny raced ahead of them, his arms full of eggs and his face bright with the satisfaction of work well done. Sarah followed more slowly, her arthritic hands careful with the gate latch but her step still sure on familiar ground. Inside the farmhouse, Rebecca heated coffee while Janet examined the changes that had transformed her childhood home. The kitchen was larger now, opened into the dining room to accommodate the groups of students who visited regularly. The living room served as a library, its shelves filled with books about agriculture, environmental science, and rural history. But the bones of the house remained unchanged, and Janet moved through the spaces with the automatic familiarity of someone returning home after a long absence. "He would have been proud," she said again, standing before the window that looked out over fields where corn stubble caught the last light of day. "Not just of what you've accomplished, but of how you've honored what he tried to do." Later that evening, after Janet had driven away carrying her father's journals and Rebecca's promise to consider the federal position, the Morrison farm settled into its familiar rhythms. Danny worked on homework at the kitchen table while Rebecca prepared tomorrow's lessons for the middle school class she still taught 3 days a week. Sarah dozed in the living room chair she'd claimed as her own, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on winter scarves for the grandchildren scattered across 3 states. The house felt full in ways that had nothing to do with the number of people it contained. The walls held memories now, not just of the Morrison family who'd built it, but of the students who'd learned here, the neighbors who'd gathered for community meetings, the federal investigators who'd testified about the importance of preserving evidence. The land itself seemed to exhale contentment, the satisfaction of earth that was being used for its intended purpose. Outside, the first frost of autumn settled over the fields like a benediction, preparing the soil for winter's rest and spring's renewal. The memorial garden would sleep now until warmer weather returned, but the work it represented would continue in courtrooms and classrooms, in the careful oversight of agricultural programs and the patient rebuilding of trust between citizens and their institutions. Rebecca stood at her bedroom window, watching stars appear in the darkening sky, and felt the profound peace that comes from knowing your place in the world. The Morrison farm was more than their home now, it was their legacy, their contribution to the ongoing story of people who chose to fight rather than surrender, who planted seeds of justice in soil that had been watered with sacrifice and tended with hope. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and choices, its own opportunities to plant questions that might grow into answers. But tonight, the land rested secure in the knowledge that it was loved and protected, that its stories would be remembered and its lessons passed down to children who would carry them forward into a future that remained unwritten but no longer unimaginable. The Morrison farm slept under stars that had witnessed everything, the struggles and betrayals, the discoveries and revelations, the slow work of healing that transforms wounds into wisdom. And in that sleep, the land dreamed of spring plantings and summer harvests, of students who would learn to ask the right questions and communities that would learn to trust again, of the patient miracle that turns seeds into sustenance and suffering into strength. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. The house was dark when Marcus returned, Charlie asleep in his room upstairs, a room with solid walls and a door that locked, security that went deeper than physical safety. This was home in a way their apartment never had been, not because it was nicer or larger, but because it represented choice rather than compromise, building rather than barely holding on. Marcus stood at his bedroom window, looking back toward the cooperage silhouetted against the night sky. 3 years ago, he'd been a man defined by failure, job lost, marriage ended, home gone, future contracted to the next crisis. That man had bid $520 on a building everyone else avoided, a decision born of desperation that had somehow transformed into purpose. The land had provided. Not through magic or miracle, but through the mundane alchemy of work applied to opportunity, of showing up when it mattered and staying when it was hard. Eugene Hartwell had understood this, even in his paranoid isolation. The cooperage wasn't just a building. It was a testament to the fact that things built well, with attention and craft and honest materials, could outlast the people who created them and serve purposes those creators never imagined. Now that legacy belonged to Marcus and Charlie, held not through legal ownership but through the daily choice to maintain, improve, and pass forward. Someday Charlie might have children who would learn coopering in the same building where their great-great-great-grandfather's tools still hung on walls. Or perhaps the building would find new stewards, people drawn to it by need and circumstance, who would discover that the cooperage gave back what you were willing to invest. Either way, the building would stand. The barrels would age whiskey that married wood and time into complexity no shortcut could achieve. The land would remember everything: the bootlegger who became paranoid, the desperate father who found salvation, the boy who learned that legacy was built rather than inherited. The stars turned overhead, indifferent and eternal, while beneath them the land breathed through seasons of planting and harvest, holding everything that had fallen into it: blood and sweat, hope and betrayal, the accumulated weight of human struggle against the patient fact of earth that outlasted all striving. Marcus turned from the window finally, ready for sleep, for tomorrow's work, for the quiet satisfaction of tending something that mattered. The cooperage waited in the darkness, solid and purposeful, a structure built to last, now fulfilling that promise through generations and circumstance its original builder could never have predicted. This was legacy, not perfect, not simple, but earned through the unglamorous work of showing up, staying present, and refusing to let valuable things die through neglect. The land had protected truth until someone ready to understand came along. Now Marcus protected the land, and the cycle continued, roots running deep into soil that remembered everything and forgave nothing but time and honest effort. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.